And we are back on the 0 hour. Many people are saying that unemployment is the highest it's been since the Great Depression. Many people are saying social unrest is as great as it's been in at least 50 years. A lot of people are saying a lot of things that involve the span of American history. So who better to discuss it with than our good friend, Harvey J. Kaye. Harvey is a historian, a sociologist, and an author. Among his recent books is Take Hold of Our History, Make America Radical Again. And he's also the director of the Center for History and Social Change at the University of Wisconsin in Green Bay, and he joins us now. So first of all, Harvey, welcome back to the program.
Thank you. So it's always a pleasure when I get to talk to you, Richard.
Well, likewise. And even, I would add, under such difficult circumstances. And speaking of these circumstances, I mentioned what's been said about unemployment rates in the Great Depression, social conflict, particularly social unrest regarding race relations in the United States. Most recent historical parallels of this magnitude I can think of might be those of the late 60s. But where do you place the events of recent weeks when it comes to the arc of American history?
Well, and I think you're right. I mean, it's almost instinctive that you and I, given our ages, would think back to the 1960s, and I think that's the place that one could readily spend a great deal of time thinking about past and present. But what might strike you as funny is that as this began to unfold, as the protests erupted, okay, and as more and more young people joined in to seek justice for the memory of what happened in Minneapolis, my mind actually went back further. My mind went back to, strangely enough, it has to do with the research I had done over this last number of years, to 1926, and to a speech that A. Philip Randolph gave on the occasion of the sesquicentennial, the 150th anniversary of American independence. And I bring this up because Randolph himself really does sort of, just as much as anyone, whether we're talking about in labor, the likes of Walter Reuther, in politics and the presidency, Franklin Roosevelt, Randolph is very much a figure of the 20th century who sort of transcends, time and place, at least in many of our minds, and probably should be remembered by more and more Americans. It's the kind of figure who deserves a monument, probably in Washington. And if there is one, then I apologize for never having gotten to see it. But
I would just interrupt, Harvey, to say, of course, A. Philip Randolph was also arguably the most influential African-American of his time, as well as being a labor leader, certainly on a par, I would say, and I'm not an expert, but I would say perhaps with who else of that time, W.E.B. Du Bois perhaps, but certainly one of the most influential and best known African-Americans of that moment, right?
Right, and he was a history maker. Okay, he was both imaginative and a real activist. And I can sort of point out some things along the way. But in 1926, he gave a speech, and he said that contrary to what too many historians have claimed, the role of African Americans in the making of democracy, okay, has been truly significant. And he pointed in particular at that time to Reconstruction in the South. And as he said, that it was African Americans who truly brought the first real democratic experience to the southern states. It was African Americans who did that during the Reconstruction era. And then he said, and this is in 1926, this is not during the 30s and the New Deal period, this is 1926, he said, perhaps the next great gift of African Americans who were already showing themselves interested in organizing labor, and he was himself the president of the Black Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, said maybe the next gift of African Americans to American democracy will be economic democracy.
Hmm.
And you know, it's hard to imagine a lot of people taking that terribly serious in 1926, but he clearly meant it. And if we think about the 1930s and the struggles of the 30s, and a prime example of how much can be accomplished when labor begins to open its ranks and literally pursues the rights of workers. You think about the CIO, although Randolph's union remained in the AFL. There was then the creation of the CIO, which were the industrial unions. And the struggles of the 30s really were struggles for democracy. In that time, we might say social and industrial democracy. Well, it's notable that in 1941, when Franklin Roosevelt proclaimed or projected a promise, a vision of four freedoms: freedom of speech and expression, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear, that Randolph listened carefully. He heard what was said, and he launched at that time the March on Washington movement. And the idea was that he was going to bring, as he put it, 10,000 African Americans to D.C. to demand the desegregation of the defense industries. Now, it's interesting to note that the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters was a phenomenal union, because as much as they were on board trains, when they traveled the country, they were able to get off those trains and make contact with local black fraternities and sororities and black churches, and basically begin to mobilize and organize people in favor of the March on Washington, which was projected to occur in June that summer of 1941. Now, I'll just make the long story short. I think I've recounted the story before with you. And that is that Roosevelt himself was very worried about the prospect of that march, in good part because Washington, D.C. was a segregated city. Woodrow Wilson had segregated Washington. And he was especially concerned, and this will have historical ring to it, what the white police force of D.C. might do, or for that matter, the white residents of D.C. might do to 10,000 black marchers. So he was concerned that violence would ensue, and he asked Eleanor to speak to A. Philip Randolph. They all knew each other, and try to dissuade him from pursuing the march. And she came back and said he would not be dissuaded. And Roosevelt himself has Randolph and Walter White, who was the NAACP, come to him in the White House. He thought he could perhaps schmooze them a bit and then talk them out of pursuing this march. Well, in the course of their schmoozing, it was pretty apparent that that Randolph and White were not ready to defer to anybody. And Roosevelt basically said to him, so I understand you're going to bring 10,000 African Americans to D.C. Is that truly your intention? And Randolph said, no, we're going to bring 100,000 marchers to D.C. And Roosevelt, leaned back a bit, sort of concerned. Then he turned to White and said, did I hear that right? And White said, yes, you did, 100,000. And that was what moves Roosevelt at that moment to sign two executive orders. One, basically demanding the opening of the defense industries to black employment, but also to create the Fair Employment Practice Commission, which was to oversee federal contracts and make sure these industries were actually admitting black employees to the ranks of their workers. Well, anyhow, during the war, the movement continued. The march itself did not take place because Roosevelt had signed those orders. Roosevelt, of course, passes away in 1945. After the war, Randolph does not necessarily pull back. He then begins a significant movement, still part of the March on Washington movement in many ways, in which he is demanding that Truman desegregate the American military. And indeed, he basically says that they would call for a boycott of the military otherwise. And Truman does act to sign the desegregation of the military. But here's where we get closer in time. Randolph, with the surge or resurgence of the civil rights struggles in the early 60s, calls for and begins to organize. Actually, he doesn't do the organizing. He's getting on in years. But he brings Bayard Rustin in, and Bayard Rustin takes charge of organizing the March on Washington movement. And in this instance, in contrast to the 1941 initiative, it will be an integrated march as opposed to only black marchers. But the big question is how are you going to get people to D.C.? That takes money. And Walter Reuther steps in and using the resources of the United Auto Workers, basically underwrites the transportation, the buses, to get black marchers from around the country to Washington. And what ensues is a march for jobs and freedom. Now, this is the key thing, and I may have left this out along the way.
Right.
Let's go back to 1926. Randolph says the next gift of African Americans to American democracy may well be economic citizenship. And please note that the march in 1963, which is remembered today for Martin Luther King's speech, I Have a Dream, and by the way, he was not an organizer, he was merely, you might say, a speaker at that event on the National Mall in DC. That was a march which was not only for civil and ultimately voting rights, it was also a march for jobs. There's that continued emphasis that Randolph has that the civil rights movement, aligned with the labor movement, should also be about economic citizenship. Perhaps in line, as you'll see in a moment, with the ideas that FDR expressed, first of all, in the Four Freedoms, and then in 1944 in his call for an economic bill of rights. Randolph, sorry, I'm going on too long. I apologize.
Okay. No, that's okay. I just wanted to interject and say that, and among other things, since you've mentioned Bayard Rustin, in his speech at the 1963 March on Washington, as you know, he called for increasing the minimum wage. I did the numbers for a piece I wrote a few years back, and I've just redone them. In September of 1963, the minimum wage was raised to $1.25, which in 2020 terms is the equivalent of more than $10 an hour. The federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. So, among other things, one of the demands made at the 63 March on Washington was to raise the minimum wage, even though it was considerably higher in real dollars than it is today. Just thought I'd throw that in.
No, thank you very much, because in fact that leads perfectly well into the point that I want to make, which I've taken a long time to get to. And that is, in 1965 and 1966, Randolph put together with his aides a pamphlet, a manifesto, which he called the Freedom Budget. He was calling for a major investment. Billions of dollars should be invested, basically, in providing, as part of the Great Society, to go beyond the Great Society, massive transformations in urban life to provide basically work for all those who wanted to work, and literally to rebuild housing and provide all the necessities of life that FDR himself had called for when he called for freedom from want and fear, and also for an economic bill of rights. So Randolph himself, it's hard to almost think of the 20th century as a progressive without thinking about A. Philip Randolph. So as I looked out at these protests, and I'm stuck at home, watching all of this as opposed to doing anything more active about it beyond Twitter. I apologize for being stuck at home. It is the case that it dawns on me that this may well be the moment, okay? Not to take anything away from the struggles of Black Lives Matter, but this may well be the moment for Black Lives Matter and the labor movement and other groups to begin to envision that this is the opportunity to make the struggle for freedom, okay, not only the struggle for freedom so as not to have to suffer the brutality and killings of the police, which should be first and foremost at this moment, but also to look beyond, that this is the moment when all these young people in their integrated marches, their integrated protests, where there's a vast majority of people right now who actually trust Black Lives Matter more than they do Donald Trump, according to the polls, that this is the time to remember A. Philip Randolph's remark that maybe the next gift of African Americans can be economic citizenship. And by the way, when FDR signed that executive order back in 1941 in response to Randolph's demands, it didn't only say African Americans should be admitted. It was the idea that regardless of race or religion, there should not be denial of employment in the defense industries. And similarly, in the Civil Rights Act, it is not simply about African Americans or even just race. It includes race, religion, and gender. So this may be that moment. I mean, truly, this could be a remarkable time in which, if we could ever get it together, and admittedly, there's no primary voice right now of leadership, we're also stuck in a presidency which is not simply deplorable, but utterly despicable and threatens fascism at every single turn. But this may be the moment when the struggle can become the struggle at the same time for, if you like, social democracy and economic citizenship, to make the four freedoms and the economic Bill of Rights all the more real. And unfortunately, Bernie Sanders isn't the standard bearer of the Democratic Party, but this may be the time.
And again, we're talking with historian and sociologist and author Harvey J. Kaye. Harvey, it's obviously, obviously we need to be sensitive to the fact that here we are, two white men talking about an primarily African-American and African-American led movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, but it gets into the sort of the interwoven thread of forces that make up any society, including our own. So when you start thinking about Black lives, which we all should be doing, you obviously have to deal with the psychological forms of oppression, the social forms of oppression, the physical forms of oppression, from incarceration to police violence and beyond. So we have to consider all those things. But as I start to pull on those threads, we start to get into, for example, some of the demands that have been put forward by the Black Lives Movement itself, which include adequate housing, which goes back to A. Philip Randolph. It goes back to the March on Washington in '63. Common thread throughout the history of the civil rights movement in this country includes adequate housing, includes economic opportunity, includes other forms of autonomy. When you start to get into pulling on those threads, for me, I don't see a way not to get into the statement that A. Philip Randolph made about economic democracy, because then you get into the other forms of racism, economic racism, the racism of inequality, the racism of unequal healthcare, environmental racism, the fact that African Americans are more likely to be exposed to unhealthy physical environments, and on and on. And to change those things, it's virtually impossible, from what my understanding, to change those things without fighting for economic democracy for all. And again, as you said, not an attempt to in any way minimize the urgency and importance of the other demands, but as this process unfolds, I don't see how you escape the approach that ultimately was espoused by Philip Randolph, espoused by Martin Luther King Jr., who was a social democrat, espoused by Malcolm X, especially in his final years post Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca and so on. I don't see how you get away from the simultaneous struggle for Black Lives Matter as we understand it now, and the fight for economic democracy. So I guess if you agree with that, my next question for you would be, what do you think A. Philip Randolph meant by economic democracy, and how would you define it?
Well, I mean, if we think back to the very things that he was pushing for, obviously there are certain fundamentals, okay? And I think the fundamentals do end up getting expressed in FDR's Economic Bill of Rights. So I think it means guarantees, as in the Bill of Rights, guarantees to, the old expression is food, clothing, and shelter, but let me be more precise. It means the right to a job, the right to a job. And that right to a job means not a job at a minimum wage, but a right to a job at a living wage. And by the way, whether we want to talk about any kind of nationalizations of industries or not, which I'm not doing just yet, it does mean, for example, that you not only are going to guarantee a living wage, you're also going to, the job that provides a living wage, you're also going to guarantee what we used to call not we, but what FDR and his cohorts called industrial democracy, and Bernie more recently in his platform called workers' democracy. That is the right to a voice in the workplace, otherwise known as workplace democracy, otherwise known as the right to organize unions and collectively bargain. John Kenneth Galbraith talked about wrote back in the 1950s about, countervailing powers. The powers of the corporation for these last 45 years have been so powerful, and which also then brings us right back to recent experiences where we saw Amazon workers and other workers literally walking out of the workplace because of the conditions they experienced, the terrible wages they experienced, and the pressures they suffered on the job. So for a start, a living wage, okay, guaranteed job and a living wage and so on. And by the way, and I've been reading Stephanie Kelton's new book, The Deficit Myth, which is, by the way, fascinating, and I hope people pick it up. As she points out, it has to be that it's a federally guaranteed job, so that if industry has not picked it up, that the federal government will guarantee full employment to everyone who wishes it at a living wage. That's for a start. Also, it has to be the case that people can afford to get an education. We have allowed ourselves for too many years to see the cost of higher education go up, the budgets in state universities not keep up with the demands. And in fact, in some cases, as here in Wisconsin, the defunding has taken place of higher education. And we also have to address the kind of serfdom that young people find themselves in because of their student loans. So that too involves economic democracy. Housing, you mentioned before, there has to be a right to good housing, okay? Whether we're talking urban or variations in suburban and rural settings, there must be that kind of guarantee. It's also the case that we could have started right from the top with some kind of Medicare for all. I'll even just call it universal health care. I mean, when you think, as we hear Bernie and others, Bernie in particular says, that basically people, they go bankrupt because they can't afford to sustain their own health. Okay, so in essence, people don't even bother to go to the doctor because they can't afford to pay the doctor. So it's the basics of living a decent, good life. And by the way, it's not just for individuals. That's how you create a good society and a truly democratic society. And that goes all the way back to the kinds of things that Thomas Paine, my original hero, called for. But A. Philip Randolph had it right. It's the fact that you've got to have jobs and freedom, or as FDR once said, necessitous men are not free men.
So I think that's an incredible description, and so I thank you for that, Harvey J. Kaye. And I guess what I would love to explore with you next, from I would call an optimistic, future-oriented historical perspective, if that's a mouthful, but is this okay? To the extent that this moment is in any way parallel with the 1930s, and I recognize the limits of historical parallels, right? Because so many forces are different from decade to decade and so on. But in the sense that what we had, as I think of the 1930s, is you had a strong and burgeoning left populist movement that manifested itself in many ways. 2 million members of the Townsend clubs calling for, what we would call, what you just key elements of what you just described as economic democracy, a rising socialist and communist left, a burgeoning union movement, a nascent civil rights movement, I would say, mostly because anything more overt than that was subject to oppression, as I understand it, unless it had, the influence of, for example, institutional power that an A. Philip Randolph had, on and on. So you had these forces, grassroots forces, appearing at a moment of great public need. And then you had eventually a president who, as you have clarified for me in past conversations, was probably more progressive than most people think. It wasn't that he was just suddenly at a road to Damascus moment when he realized how bad things are, but always had this strain of economic democracy in him, and that, of course, being Franklin D. Roosevelt. But you had this combination of a president who could influence his party, which was deeply infused with racism at the time, and you had these popular movements prodding and helping him. that, to my understanding, was the architecture of change in the 1930s. What might the architecture of change, in your view, look like in the 2020s?
Well, I actually think, first thing to remember, of course, is that we've literally experienced 45 years of class war from above. So all of the solidarities that had emerged back in the 30s, that had been enhanced in the course of the 1960s, that, by the way, the right truly feared, and that capitalists themselves feared in the 1970s, because they truly expected a broad progressive movement to cohere, to come together in the 70s and create a truly social democratic America. And you can read about it in all of the documents of the day, whether it's the Lewis Powell Memorandum to the Chamber of Commerce, or David Rockefeller's speeches to his fellow bankers, or the Trilateral Commission's report on the crisis of democracy. They truly feared the possibility of a coalition of forces, of labor, both private and public employees, of the women's movement, of the civil rights movement, of the poor people's movement, of young people who had come to, for the first time perhaps in many, many decades, come to be seen as a progressive force in the United States, as opposed to merely a rebellious, youthful energy kind of force. So there were those things happening. And of course, they mobilized more effectively than the left ever did in the 1970s. So we've had 45 years in which we've seen the smashing of labor, we've seen the containment of civil rights, we've seen young people's energies, dissipated in so many different directions. And yet, if we think back just several years ago, there was an incredible percolation from the bottom up, including, first and foremost, Black Lives Matter, including the anti-fracking and anti-pipeline campaigns, including the Fight for 15. I mean, the Moral Monday movement that emerged in North Carolina. And the Reverend Barber, who I think can play a significant role in everything I'm talking about, is, I believe, still now the head of the Poor People's Movement that was launched back in the late 60s and is now, I think, an even more significant force. So there were those percolations. However, we did not see, for lack of a better term, consolidation. We did not see the articulation of those movements into a broad left. I think Bernie Sanders imagined that happening with his campaign, and that he would bring into the primary campaigns and the primary voting a whole new array of forces. They did not all turn out. But now, when we see all of this energy in the streets, a truly diverse set of energies. I mean, you see black and white young people together, and you can't help but imagine that many of those young white people themselves are carrying student debt burdens, and that their anger is an anger that is not only directed at the police, but also directed at the fact that millions of Americans, due to the pandemic, are without employment and have lost their health care, that they themselves may well have lost their health care because their own parents have lost their health care. They're out of jobs. I mean, there's the anger, but you can also see these are young people, and they are not afraid of talking of social democracy, of talking economic citizenship. The question is, how do we bring them together? I mean, I have a fantasy moment where leadership of Black Lives Matter, or the leadership of the labor movement, that they find their way together, and that they somehow can do this massive, this is a fantasy moment perhaps, this massive town hall where you get the likes of the Reverend Barber, you get Richard Trumka, or even more significantly, Sarah Nelson. You get a whole host of people who are the new voices, in some cases middle-aged voices or older voices of these movements, who recognize that now is the time to recognize the visions, aspirations of A. Philip Randolph and the Black labor movement and the Black civil rights movement, the vision and the aspirations of Franklin Roosevelt, the Democrats and the Popular Front of the 1930s, the struggles of the 1960s for civil rights, voting rights, for public employee unionism. And, that to me is where the possibilities lie, but we shouldn't be naive about it. It is also the case that even if Trump is failing and falling, you might say, it is the case that the forces that he's unleashed are not eager to see the emergence of a social democratic America, or for that matter, any kind of further democratic America.
When you say the forces that he's unleashed, Harvey J. Kaye, are you thinking about the reactionary forces, I assume? Or...
Well, to me, there's actually, William, what's his name? Barr. Is his first name William? I'm forgetting for the moment.
William,
You think about William Barr. William Barr represents a truly retrograde kind of force that links together a kind of sort of reactionary, sort of pre-New Deal understanding of the law, as well as probably links into white nationalism and Christian nationalism. You also had the unleashing of those Nazis and white supremacists on the streets. But look at the Republican Party. The Republican Party is as close as you can get to being a far-right party as possible. I mean, really, think about what those folks are about. Think about the billions of dollars, if not trillions of dollars of gifts over time that they're affording the wealthy, and their willingness literally to dispossess, even now, what's left of working people's incomes and savings to survive. I mean, they're ready to act. In fact, I guess we should be thankful that at least there's still enough of a commitment to the Constitution that military leaders balked at the idea of sending federal troops into the cities and told Trump that he better learn a lesson about the Constitution.
Well, I guess, and my other fear before I let you go is, I appreciate your vision a lot. My other fear is, of course, as you would understand, I think, cooption of this moment by people who, while I won't name them, might want to wear kente cloth in the halls of Congress and take a knee, and yet not introduce and pass bills in the House or Senate that would create substantial change, either when it comes to Black lives or economic democracy. So I'm a little bit afraid of this moment being dissipated by lip service, but I guess that's where outside activism comes in.
Richard, if I could just add a note, and I really tried to avoid making. I mean, it was a comical moment when Pelosi went on TV and showed off her super freezer filled with Edie's ice creams. Okay, I mean, and that was just that I thought was like as insensitive as one could be, and then that performance by the Democrats this past week, the kente cloth. I thought to myself, don't they have any savvy at all? I mean, what is this about, this performance? Okay, do something meaningful. Okay, I mean that's like just I was embarrassed for them because they didn't know to be embarrassed. But I also want to make clear, as you asked me something before, I don't want anyone to misunderstand. I'm not looking to hijack this moment for some broad social democratic project. What I'm talking about is that this is the moment of unity. 1930s, they called it a united front or a popular front. This is the time for unity to realize the aspirations of the diverse forces that make up what we think of as progressivism.
Well, I think that's extremely well said. And I wasn't going to name Pelosi or Schumer, but yes. And I think I would like to see the Democrats taking more of a leadership role in reflecting the moment in all its dimensions. But having said that, they did put forward a pretty good criminal justice reform bill. It doesn't have nearly everything I would want or the movement would want, but good. I would like to see that extend further. But I think your point, perhaps our closing point, is that a popular front was always something that came from the people and not from the elected leadership, right?
Right, that's right. But it did find a way to make sure that FDR won the presidency again. And FDR himself, even if he didn't embrace all of the elements of the Popular Front, he knew full well that the popular imagination needed the kind of example that the Popular Front was setting.
Well said. And unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But Harvey J. Kaye, historian, author, sociologist, and professor at University of Wisconsin, Green Bay, as always, great to hear your thoughts. And as always, thank you for coming on the program.
I appreciate you tremendously, Richard, for giving me a chance to speak. Thank you.
And we will be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour.